the Society of Emergency Medicine's Research Learning Series. I'm Dr. Lynn Rapolo from the University of Texas Southwestern, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's session on the Institutional Review Board, or IRB, process. So this session is an interactive discussion with 3 experienced researchers in emergency medicine, and our goal is to hopefully provide some very helpful information, some pearls and pitfalls of the IRB process. So before I begin, I just wanted to start by welcoming and introducing our panelists. So Dr. Adrienne Malik, I think you could assume who that is, but she is an assistant professor of emergency medicine at the University of Kansas Medical Center in Kansas City. She is a core faculty member of the residency program and received her MD from Saba University and completed her EM residency and ultrasound fellowship at DMC Sinai Grace Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. She currently serves as the Director of Research Training for the Department of Emergency Medicine, which includes overseeing trainee research projects and the bi-monthly resident research workshop. She currently serves as PI for multiple investigator-initiated and industry-funded studies and has been a member of the KU Human Subjects Committee in IRB since 2020. So welcome, Dr. Malik. And Dr. Mysek, he is currently a professor of emergency medicine at Rush Medical College and chair of research in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Cook County Health and vice chair of the Cook County Health IRB. He completed his MD at the University of Illinois, residency at Boston City Hospital and Boston Medical Center, his fellowship in medical toxicology at Cook County Hospital, and a degree in clinical bioethics at Northwestern University. He has been on the editorial board at Academic Emergency Medicine since 2003 and leads their resident editor program. His research focuses on publication ethics, use of novel antidotes for toxicologic overdosages, and implementation of acupuncture as an opioid-sparing analgesia strategy in BED. Welcome, Dr. Mysek.
Hello, everybody.
And last but certainly not least, Dr. James Paxton. He received his MD and MBA degrees from the University of Cincinnati before completing his emergency medicine residency at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. He is currently an associate professor of emergency medicine at Wayne State University School of Medicine in Detroit. Dr. Paxton works clinically in emergency departments at Detroit Receiving Hospital and Sinai Grace Hospital, and is a member of the core academic faculty at both of these institutions. He has mentored hundreds of medical students and residents on various research projects. Dr. Paxton recently served as chairman of the WSU MP2 Institutional Review Board from 2015 to 2020, and is currently the DRH Director of Clinical Research. He is an active clinical researcher and has served as principal investigator for numerous industry and publicly funded trials. He has edited several books on emergency medicine topics, including a recent primer focused on resident research and scholarly projects in emergency medicine. So welcome, Dr. Paxton.
Thank you.
So as you can see, we have an amazing group of panelists who are very qualified to address this topic. So without further ado, we're going to do some rapid fire questions, and we'll save any questions in the chat for the end. So hopefully you won't have many questions because hopefully we'll cover everything. So when I first started research, I was always frustrated. Actually, I'm still a little frustrated, but by the feedback and so many questions that they wanted addressed. This is IRB. So some seemed so basic or things that I thought did not need to be addressed at all. So who are these people? Who exactly is on the IRB? And so like once you submit, who reviews it before it goes to committee, and who actually is on this committee? So Dr. Mysek, why don't you start?
Oh, great. Lynn, that's a great question. And I think part of our goal here is to demystify the whole IRB purpose and who is on the IRB. So I think a lot of people misunderstand the IRB right now, and they think it's a bunch of evil people who are obstructionist and trying to prevent research from happening. And that's not really the case at all. I mean, the IRB really values human life, and we want to protect human subjects. So most institutions have an IRB that's fairly similarly organized. They are required to have an IRB if they participate in any type of research. And the IRB includes physicians, scientists, nurses and pharmacists and other stakeholders in the research enterprise at that institution. And other stakeholders include a member who is not currently a member of that institution. They offer some objective evaluation. And most IRBs also include community members, those who have no scientific background whatsoever, people who are there to listen and make sure that whatever research is conducted is done ethically and fairly in order to contribute some value to what we know is medical knowledge. That's really the membership of the IRB, and some IRBs are huge, some are smaller. It all depends on how much research is done and what the makeup is of the rest of the institution. But I'll let the others comment, but it's not just a bunch of evil scientists who are obstructionists.
Yeah, I think another important thing to keep in mind is that specifically that there are community members on the IRB. So what may be important to you in a study with your medical background may not necessarily be the kinds of things that are zeroed in on by the community member or even some of the other physician members of the team who are not part of the specialty that the research being presented is relevant to. So for example, on the IRB at my institution, I review a lot of studies that are immunologic drug studies and cancer studies, which is not my background. I am an emergency medicine physician. So just some of the things that you may think are very obvious to your study based on your specialty are not going to be things that are necessarily obvious to the various members of the IRB because they are not all going to be the same specialty as you.
Dr. Katzman, can you address when you submit it, where does it go? Like, who's that first person that actually like?
Well, it probably depends on the individual IRB, but I think in general terms, think of it this way. You're dropping off, whether virtually or in real life, a packet of information that is going to pass through several hands. There'll be someone who's like a secretary type position, people who will review it to make sure you filled out all the forms or at least presented all the documents they were expecting. And then that gets handed off to an individual who is one member of the IRB staff, somebody who's probably paid to work with the IRB. Maybe it's an IRB coordinator or director, and they will review your application and determine whether or not your application requires what they call full board review or not. And in some cases, they will determine that it requires a full board review. We'll talk more about what that means, but that's really the full Monty, okay? Alternatively, they may say, well, this doesn't require full board, but it requires an expedited review. So that would be a less formal review by maybe one person who would review it, and that's minimal risk stuff, and or it could be exempt. So that once that person makes that decision, then it gets passed on to the next people in line. So in terms of who's in the IRB, well, the IRB is an organization. It's not one person. It's not even one committee at most places. Most places there's multiple committees. And you may not even know, unless you're looking into it, which committee you're going to be in front of or your proposal is going to be considered by. But each committee actually may have different makeup. So when I served as 5 years as chair of an IRB committee, my committee changed every year. I had a couple people come in, a couple people leave. There were a dozen people on my committee. We always had to have, by our IRB policy, at least one community member in the room at all times, or we couldn't vote. And that was how important it is to have community representation. We also had to have a non-scientist in the room, or we couldn't vote. So that was how we did it. And that's how, a lot of IRBs do it. So you have to keep in mind that not only is there diversity, but it's required that there's diversity. And the reason it's required is exactly why you need IRB review. The IRB, its primary purpose is to assure that investigators are taking appropriate steps to protect the rights and welfare of humans participating as subjects in research. So what that means is their primary function of reviewing your protocol is to make sure that the patients are safe, that their rights and welfare are being protected. It's not, and we'll talk about this later, to assess the scientific validity of your design, of your study design, or the likely outcome of your study, or any of the other things that people get obsessed about. It's really truly looking at patient protection. And so when you recognize that, and that the IRB is formulated of people that have never done research, some of them aren't health professionals. I had a lawyer on our committee at one point. We had people who are retired from other jobs. So ultimately, you have to speak to and write as if you're addressing an average layperson In fact, many people on the IRB would be considered laypersons by the medical standard. So I think that's an important distinction to make when you're talking about who constitutes an IRB.
All very helpful comments, and they are not obstructionists.
Not
So,
obstructionists.
Thank you all. So second question. So there is sometimes confusion as to what studies actually need IRB approval. And if you want to publish something that may not require IRB approval, such as like a quality improvement project or whatever, that maybe journals still want you to mention that in your methodology. So mainly, can you comment on what studies actually need IRB approval? And Dr. Malik, can you start?
Sure. So the way that I try to explain this to my trainees is any study on people, if you are studying people, you need to consider that this will need to go through the IRB. The biggest thing that makes something requiring IRB approval is the study of human subjects. And this gets a little dicey when, especially with survey studies, because people think, oh, I'm just doing a survey study, I don't need to submit this to the IRB for approval. But surveys, depending on what data you are collecting, may actually be researching human subjects and their responses. So that is actually something that in many cases does require some level of our IRB approval and review. But so for the most part, if you are planning on doing a study on humans and you intend to gather results that you want to publish, which would make something generalizable, that's probably something that needs to be reviewed by your IRB. Even with some of the QI protocols, a lot of times people will start out doing a QI project and then halfway through decide that they want to change this into a project that they go out and publish. This is kind of why it's better to go through the IRB to start with, so that you have that approval from the get-go, so that you're not trying to figure out how you can alter your project to be approved by whatever journal you end up submitting it to after you've already started it. So most IRBs will have some sort of outline on their website about what they do or do not consider requiring their oversight. And so the simplest thing to do is, if you're going to embark on a study, go to your institution's IRB website and kind of look at what your institution specifically wants reviewed by the IRB. It's kind of a pain in the butt, I know, to have to take a project that seems small and insignificant through the IRB process, but it's better to start out that way than to find out after you've already, invested time and resources into trying to do something that you didn't get approval from the get-go and you needed it, because it will make it so that it's much more difficult for you to get anything published or to do anything with the results that you've put so much time into getting. So when in doubt, go through your IRB. And the basic thing that requires some degree of IRB review or oversight is if you are going to be studying human subjects.
Thank you. Dr. Misek, why don't you comment on that too?
No, I think Dr. Malik explained everything perfectly. I just wanted to reemphasize a couple of things that she said. When in doubt, just reach out to the IRB. I much prefer that somebody just picks up the phone and calls me and asks, hey, I'm thinking of doing this study. Do I need to go through the IRB or not? And I'll quickly answer their question. We do have resources on our website, but our IRB is friendly and we are open to all questions because we do want to help people do good work. And I think one of the key points that was made by Dr. Malik is the word planning. When you are doing any type of planning, that constitutes research. Now, sometimes people ask me, do I need to get IRB approval for a case report? Well, case reports are unplanned encounters that just happen, and you're trying to get some information on. So those are not subject to any IRB review whatsoever, because that's an unplanned event and you're trying to disseminate that in a journal. Now, some journals require patient consent for disseminating that information because most medical scholarship today is disseminated electronically and via social media. And that's why most journals today do require some form of consent for case reports, but those do not go through IRB approval. And just one final point, just for efficiency's sake, I think the work that goes into an IRB application is already a lot of the work that goes into the final manuscript. And I think people forget that. A lot of the language that you use in your IRB application can easily be copy and pasted into the introduction and the methods of the eventual manuscript. So it's not extra work. It's actually more efficient. And good researchers try to be efficient.
Very good point. Thank you. I'm glad you brought up case reports. And so I was having this conversation with Dr. Malik before we started, and we just tell our residents, if you're thinking about, interesting case that might be published as a case report, just go ahead and get consent, because it's so hard to do retrospectively and trying to chase somebody down after they got discharged, sort of thing. Dr. Paxton, can you just talk about the exemption letter?
Well,
From
yeah, no, I'd be glad to. So, and I touched on this previously, but there really are three primary ways that the IRB manages submissions. And by the way, these are determinations made by the IRB. These are decisions, if you will, that the IRB makes about your application. So when you submit an application, they'll decide it's either full board, expedited, or exempt. And full board is, well, that's standard. That's the default. That goes in front of the entire committee, and they all vote and decide if it's acceptable or not. Expedited happens maybe quicker, maybe not quicker, depending on your IRB in question. But the point is, it doesn't require the full board. It just usually one, maybe two people look at it and decide that it's okay or not. And it's a much simpler process, thereby sometimes faster, but not always. Not always faster, even though it's called expedited, it isn't always expedited. The third category is exempt. And what is exempt? And I think that's an important question. And the previous, Mark and Addie have touched on this in the sense that sometimes we're not sure if our study requires IRB review or not. And the best way to find out, honestly, is to give it to the IRB and say, what do you think? Is this something that you need to be approving or reviewing? And if they decide it is not something that they need to be reviewing formally or approving, you get an exemption letter. It's exempt, and exempt means simply doesn't apply to us. It's not an approval letter. It doesn't mean that you have approval to do the research. In fact, it means the exact opposite. It means the IRB is not even having an opinion on your research. And it's delivered or issued specifically because somebody requested that assessment to be made. And so it's a good thing. And sometimes it's a very important thing. There are situations in which perhaps it's not required. If your study clearly does not even touch on being human subjects research, then that would be unnecessary. But I think many times I've found myself, I'm sure others have found themselves in a gray zone where they're not 100% sure, is this research, is this something else? And they'll submit that to the IRB for that exemption consideration. I think it's important to bring up here, your question asked about what studies, what type of investigations require IRB review. And I think the answer I would provide to that is that things that require IRB review are things that are, number one, research, right? Lots of things are being done to investigate things that are not really research. Number two, involves human subjects. And I don't just mean necessarily alive human beings, although that's the biggest category, but it also applies to their data, right? So if somebody dies, their personal identifier data is still considered protected, right? You can't just go take that data. It still has privacy protection relevant, and therefore the IRB would still be involved. Even though the person's dead, perhaps the IRB will feel that they need to grant approval or review for use of their data. And then third, it has to involve an interaction with humans or access to their identifiable information. So it's not just about necessarily doing things that interact with humans. It's also sometimes about using their data. And I think, or collecting their specimens sometimes, collecting blood from a patient, for example. These are things that, it gets kind of technical and kind of difficult. But I think if you think about it, those three things, is it research? Does it involve humans? Is there an interaction or access to their data? If you think of those three things, you'll know whether it's research or not. Now, one caveat to that I think is important to mention, that's quality improvement. And a lot of people, especially learners, especially residents and students, are going to be doing quality improvement projects. And they're going to want to know, is this research, is this IRB under the IRB purview or not? The answer is, well, it's difficult, right? But at the end of the day, I would say this, and I think Mark talked about this, if your intention going into the project is that you're going to publish these results, you're doing it to publish the results, I don't have a question about that. That's absolutely research. That's absolutely not QI, in my opinion. I think there are exceptions to that. The important thing is not just the intention, it's also the execution. Was it performed? Was it planned? I think was what was said. Is it planned as a research project or not? Many times things begin as a QI project and they transform, or they're revisioned as a research project. Maybe you collected the data for one reason, now you want to publish it and release it for another reason. There's a gray zone here, right? But I think at the end of the day, a true QI project has to be something that was intended to be quality improvement. So in other words, it was not intended to yield generalizable results. You were just doing it at your location to assess something locally in your environment. You weren't going to publish it. You're just looking at it for you and your colleagues at your particular institution. That's QI, sure. But as soon as you start considering collecting additional data elements that were not part of that initial data set that was done for QI reasons, or as soon as you expand the project to include additional intervention or interaction with the patients, it becomes research. So it's very difficult to know sometimes. My suggestion, as Mark said, reach out. And Addie said, reach out, ask the IRB, what do you think? It doesn't take much.
Sounds like it's just better to be safe than sorry. It's not going to hurt you, but it could potentially really help you. So I'm going to skip question number 3, unless actually Dr. Malek or Dr. Misick, do you have any, because it was the different IRB like levels. Do you have anything to add on that? Question number 3 was, we're going to talk about the different types of IRB reviews, but thank you, James. You're very thorough in your response. So it was very helpful. Anything to add?
I would just say that,
oh,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
First.
The only other thing that I would add to this, specifically with regarding case reports, which agree for the most part are exempt from IRB review. In a lot of places, if you start trying to do a case series that involves more than 3 to 4 cases, then your institution will require the IRB involvement. And honestly, a lot of journals request that too. So same thing. A lot of people are like, oh, I can just do a quick case series. This will be easy. But you have to be careful, because once you start trying to draw conclusions based on multiple case studies, like Dr. Paxton said, then it becomes research, and you will likely need some level of IRB documentation or approval for that.
So I wanted to say, if your N is greater than 1, it is no longer a case report, and you just need to go through IRB. It's basically a retrospective study, and I think because it does require some planning, for sure. But the whole expedited issue is important. Even though the IRB is telling you and your team, we are not going to be involved, when you submit that work to a journal, it is important to disclose that line in the methods. And as a journal editor, I'm an editor at a few different journals, people often forget to include that line. And we will write back to the authors and say, hey, what did your IRB think about this? Because we're going to reject this unless you just include that line. And they say, oh yeah, it was expedited. Was I supposed to include that? And we say, yes, please put that line into the methods, and we will send it out for peer review.
Great. Very helpful. Thank you both.
Or did I'm sorry, exempt. Did I say expedited? I meant to say
Mark,
exempt. I'm really sorry.
I didn't want to be rude.
Exempt.
I thought that was what you meant.
Yep.
Exempt, yeah.
Sorry.
So let's move on to another question. So this question involves, how do you set yourself up for IRB approval success, if you will? So one thing I wanted to mention, that it just seems like there's always a delay, because all these things that are addressed. So how can you set yourself up so the IRB doesn't have a lot to say about your study, to minimize all these questions and back and forth, and it's just another delay. So Dr. Malek, can you talk about that, please?
Sure. So this is where it pays to be a little detail oriented from the start. There are going to be a lot of things that the IRB is going to look at closely and wants you to have in order to get you through the process and get you your approval that you want. So the first things that I think is important when you're trying to set yourself up for success is decide early who your key personnel are going to be on the study, and then make sure that they all have their city training and that they've all done their conflict of interest forms, which need to be done on a yearly basis. So at my institution, one of the things that we do, at least for our residents, is during their July month, we have them all do city training, so that literally every resident in our residency is ready to go to be key personnel on one of our faculty studies. So that's not an issue. That is something that can get your study held up if your key personnel aren't appropriately qualified to be key personnel. So that's an easy thing to take care of kind of right out the gate. Another thing that I recommend that people do is to really take a good look at the checklist that your IRB has for what information they want from your protocol. If you're using equipment within the hospital that requires approval from your bio department, you need to have that submitted as a form. And then the biggest one for me is to make sure that your consent form that you have decided to use for your study is understandable by laypersons. So a lot of times when I'm doing my consent forms, I will have one of my family members read it to make sure that it's understandable to them. One of the biggest holdups in our IRB section is our community member who will go through consent forms and say that he does not understand them. And then that means that it's not digestible in lay language to the people that we are going to be approaching for enrollment in this study. And that honestly is one of the biggest things that holds up studies, is when the consent form is not deemed to be understandable by the people that you are going to be approaching as subjects.
Great. Very helpful. High yield staff. Dr. Misick, what do you think?
I don't really have much to add other than reemphasizing the attention needed to the consent form. I think it's one of those items that is often thought about at the very end, but it really needs to be thought about early on, because that is one of the holdups, and that is one of the more common reasons in our IRB where studies are sent back and they're not approved right away, because we want the consent form fixed. The language needs to be dialed down, so it needs to be understood by everybody. And I actually like the suggestion of having your family members take a look at it. When I help residents and faculty prepare survey studies, I also have them pilot those survey studies as well, because we want these surveys to be understood by the end user and not just by the super smart doctor who is putting the survey together.
Very helpful. Thank you. Dr. Paxton.
Yeah, this is a great question, actually. I think at the end of the day, how you can prepare yourself for success is really not just with the IRB, it's how you can prepare yourself for success with your study, right? So the things you need for your IRB submission are not that different than what you need to have a successful study. My suggestion is, before you consider submitting something to the IRB, make sure you have a well-written, clear, concise protocol. I don't suggest submitting to the IRB without a protocol. What do I mean by a protocol? Well, there are a lot of elements in a protocol. It's not just about a one-paragraph description of your study. You need to sit down and think out about your background, the rationale for your study. You have to have a hypothesis for a protocol, methods, inclusion, exclusions, risks and benefits to subjects, provisions for adverse events. How am I going to recruit subjects? Who's going to be in my study? Who's the PI? Who are the co-Is? Who's the biostats person? Who's the regulatory person? All of this information is going to be needed by the IRB, but more importantly, all this information is going to be needed by you when you're executing your study. You're not going to do a study without having this information already available. So my suggestion is, if you're worried about the IRB, sit down and work on your protocol. If you have a good protocol and it's well written, it writes, the IRB submission writes itself. Because you're really, I mean, I hate to say cut and paste, because no IRB member wants to hear the words cut and paste. But that's kind of what you're going to do. You're just going to look at the protocol and say, oh, this is what I should put in this answer. Most of the questions that they ask you in the IRB submission are things that are automatically going to be in your protocol already. So that's not an issue. I agree on making sure your key personnel have completed requirements, and that includes the COI, conflict of interest, but also probably city training. For those who don't know what city training is, it's essentially online training on research methods and ethics that's required for anyone who does clinical or for that matter, basic science research. And it has to be kept up to date so that your training is refreshed every so often. Those are important things. Those are things that get messed up a lot. I hear a lot of people ask me, well, okay, but do I need to do like an extensive literature review? Do I need to have my statistics plan written out? All these, do I need to do a pilot study before I submit to the IRB? I don't think any of those things are things the IRB is looking for. They're not really looking at those things. They're more focused on, as I say before, risk, benefit, and safety, protection of subjects. So unless your aforementioned literature review / pilot study is going to shed some light on that, I don't think it's a priority. I think the priority when you're submitting to IRB is focus on the things they're going to care the most about, which will be things relevant to patients and patient-facing risk-benefit ratio.
So all those things you just mentioned are important for planning your study, because I think research is just planning, and then just when you actually do the research, it's filling in the blank. But that is not critical for the IRB itself.
I would caution, this is not to say that you can just, submit a protocol with your submission that's extremely basic and not well thought out. It's one of the things that, at least for me, when I'm reviewing something, gives me a red flag if it looks like they haven't described anything in detail about one of the things the IRB also looks at is patient safety and patient data safety. So that's one of the things that I would want to see in a protocol is a decent description of how you're keeping your patient safe and how you're going to keep the data safe. So you may not have to have all of the points that we look for when we are, say, doing a peer review of a manuscript that's been submitted to a journal, but for IRB purposes, it has to be at least well fleshed out enough that I can see that you've put thought into the process of how you are going to be enrolling your patients and what you're going to be do to protecting them and their data as you go through this process. So while this doesn't have to be necessarily as methodologically detailed as we would necessarily want to see for a journal review, you do have to have enough in there that the IRB is going to be able to see that you've planned this out well and your patients are going to be protected through the process. So that's another thing in terms of attention to detail in your submission that you might want to address.
Great, thank you. And all of these things collectively can delay your study significantly, which is not fun. So next question, let's just talk about who needs to actually be on the IRB. And if you can just briefly talk about the PI, who can be the PI? Can students be PIs at institutions? I know residents can, but also who needs to be included on the actual IRB application itself? Because it seems that if you have all these authors on a manuscript, but they're not actually all on the IRB. So if you don't mind just clarifying those questions. So Dr. Misek?
Oh, sure. No, that's a great question. And I think who can be the PI varies from institution to institution. So where I am at Cook County Health, if you're a trainee, you cannot be the PI on any IRB approved project. Even if you're a fellow, you cannot be a PI. It has to be a faculty member, a licensed physician. But that varies from institution to institution. Basically, the key personnel are those who are involved in any aspect or steps of the research process, including handling that data. So some of these people may not be authors at the end of the study. Some of these people on the IRB application might be research assistants who end up acknowledged at the end of the paper, but they aren't authors. So that's an important distinction. The most important person is the PI because that person is responsible for every single aspect of the project from beginning to end. When it works well and there's great knowledge that's added, they celebrate. When there's a problem, the PI is responsible and needs to answer questions, whether there's an adverse event that happens or data are lost. They're lost on a laptop that got left behind on a subway. And this is why it's important to disclose all those details. I mean, you need to write down in an IRB application, all of the data are going to be held on a laptop that's password protected, that is locked in an office in the PI's building, wherever it is. Because we read this in newspapers almost every week where there's some kind of, data loss and patients' protected information is disclosed to a whole bunch of people because something was left behind. So that's really important. And again, the PI is ultimately responsible for that information. And again, these studies take a long time. So we'll see at the end of the study who ends up being an author or not. But good practice in doing any kind of research is to figure out early on who are going to be the key players and what their authorship role is going to be if they stick with the study to the very end. Because I've seen some disagreements towards the end of the study where somebody joins late and now they want to be the first author or they want to be the second author. The most important positions are the first and the last. And then in between, it all depends on how many people are involved.
Great, thank you. Dr. Malik, do you have anything to add?
I would just add that in terms of who is PI on the study, I agree. Most institutions will make it so that it's faculty who can be the PI and not residents or fellows. And in terms of authorship, I am the PI for several of my resident research projects, but it is discussed in advance of starting the project that the resident is going to be the first author. It is their project. They just require me to be the PI for purposes of IRB approval. But the discussion of authorship and PI per purposes of the IRB are kind of different things. So I would just recommend as a good practice when you embark on a research project, when you get started, you have the discussion of authorship with everybody who's going to be involved. And then in terms of the key personnel that you're going to be using on your study, I would encourage everybody to, use people who understand the importance of following the protocol and protecting subject data as key personnel. This is something that you really want to impress on people, because at the end of the day, you as the PI are responsible if one of those key personnel does something that results in a breach of data or a protocol deviation. And some of these can be incredibly serious with very far-reaching consequences depending on the level of study that you're doing. So really have a good conversation with your key personnel that you're going to be working with about the importance of sticking to the protocol and protecting your subject data.
Great, thank you. Dr. Paxton, do you have anything to add?
Well, I can make a couple comments. So I think good points have been made here. At the end of the day, the principal investigator is, for lack of a better analogy, the captain of the ship. If the ship goes down, it's ultimately the captain's fault. It doesn't matter whether the captain actually made the problem or is the one responsible for not addressing the problem. It's still the captain's problem and the captain failed. So the PI, whether the PI likes it or not, is ultimately responsible for everything that happens under the purview of their study. And what I've seen as a chair of an IRB committee sometimes is that the PIs they either don't acknowledge or understand that, or they will claim that they don't acknowledge or understand that. And I think that's a difficult situation. But at the end of the day, if you're willing to step up and be the PI of a study, you're responsible for everything that happens in that study. And so it's important for that person to be aware of what's going on within their study, but also to be aware of the regulatory guidance, the rules, if you will, of playing the game and doing research. Ignorance is no excuse. It's no protection from things that were done wrong or not done at all. So I think, co-investigators, on the other hand, are often people who are just one notch below the PI, and those individuals have similar responsibilities to the PI, but they're not ultimately responsible for the study. Right? That's the important distinction between a PI and a co-I. And as far as authorship goes, I would argue that the IRB has no interest in authorship matters. The IRB is not there to talk about authorship. They don't care. It doesn't have to be submitted to them, nor would they want it to be submitted to them. Authorship happens usually way later than the IRB process happens. And then my take on authorship is that authorship depends on the amount of work put in and by whom. And that typically with a large study, the PI is often going to be either the first or last author. They're going to take the most prominent position because they deserve it. They theoretically designed the study and probably did the most work, presumably. However, papers, oftentimes a large study will yield maybe a dozen papers. Well, they're not going to be the first author on every paper, and nor should they want to be. And usually someone else on the study team will take the reins and develop their own sub-question, and then they'll make a paper and they'll be first author and so on. And maybe the PI is the last author. So at the end of the day, like, authorship is almost irrelevant to the IRB submission process. The IRB certainly isn't interested in it. And I would say I agree with the statements that have been made previously about authorship. At the end of the day, I think at my institution, it's the same as what the other panelists have mentioned, that it needs to be a faculty member at my institution, my university, who is the PI. But what I do when I work with students and residents is I'll say, well, yeah, you can't be the PI for purposes of the IRB, but you're still the PI in my heart. You know, you're still in charge of this study. I still expect you to do the PI's job, but yeah, the IRB isn't going to recognize you, and I'm sorry about that, but it's paperwork, and that's how it works.
Very good point. So it seems the IRB is really strict now, or more strict on any protocol violation. So all the points that you brought up here are incredibly important. And the only reason why I brought up the whole resident being a PI at our main hospital at Parkland, it used to be if a resident was on the study, then you can get the resident fee for the hospital. And they increased the fee for faculty. And they said that if a resident was the PI, only if the resident was a PI, could you get the reduced fee. So I resubmitted this IRB just to see, and I made the resident the PI, and it got approved. So I don't know, I guess maybe they overlooked that, or I don't know, maybe it's a new
No,
rule.
I think this relates to different IRBs having different policies, and there's
definitely
no federal guidance on this at all. I don't think there's any federal guidance on who can be a PI if they're qualified otherwise. So I think this is a site-by-site distinction.
Definitely. So our next question is, how long should you plan on for preparing the IRB, and when you're planning your whole study? How long does it take? Should you submit like 2 months, 4 months, 6 months? I mean, it's seeming for me personally that it's taking a long time, so I'm submitting a lot earlier. Dr. Paxton, can you talk about that first?
I would say this, at my site, we have 3 IRB committees. Each of them meets once a month. The deadline for submission is 2 weeks before their meeting. So from the time I submit to the time I get a letter that says congratulations or sorry, it's a month. It's a month. It doesn't matter what I do. I can beg, plead, cry, crawl through the door with my hands up. It doesn't matter. It's going to take a month. So that's the minimum. Now, reality is it depends, like how fast it gets past the IRB depends on how much work I put in and whether it was a good, submission. So if I'm not doing my job right when I submit it and I missed a lot of questions and I didn't answer things that I was supposed to answer, or I didn't think things out, or I didn't put it in the right terms, I didn't use layperson terms, they're going to find tons of stuff that's wrong with it. And they're going to say, well, you need to resubmit this because we have revisions that are required, right? And maybe they'll give me an approval pending those revisions, which by the way, have to be reviewed by somebody in the IRB after I resubmit. Or maybe they'll just say, we want you to resubmit it next month. But either way, it's a delay of a month. So every time that I forget to do one thing, it's a month if they think it's important enough. And I may not know what they think is important. So my encouragement and my suggestion to anyone is the more time you spend before you submit, the less time you're going to spend after you submit, because the better your application is the first time, the quicker you get through. And even if they do find something that you need to resubmit, it may be 1 month delay, not 2, 3, 4 months. So I would say for the average person, give yourself 2 or 3 months from the time you have a completed protocol ready to turn in till the time that you need to be ready to go with the research and implementing your actual study. That's
Great.
my side.
Dr. Meissig.
Yeah, those are all great suggestions. A lot of it depends on how often the IRB committees meet at that institution. And recently, a lot of it depends on the volume of submissions to that IRB. If you have an important project that is dependent on funding or some other circumstances, there again is nothing wrong with picking up the phone and calling your IRB committee and telling them, hey, I've got this project and we have this funding and it really needs to be done within this time frame. Is there any way you could please prioritize it, assuming I do my work and get all of the application material in on time and as required by the IRB committee? And at least our IRB committee is accommodating and will help, because again, the IRB's purpose is to help people get their research done as long as it's done ethically and fairly, and hopefully contribute something to medical knowledge.
Great, thank you. Dr. Malik.
Again, agree with what both of the other panelists said. And I would just say, how early should you submit your IRB package? As early as possible. And then in terms of trying to do what you can to make it take a shorter period of time to get approval, focus on those consent forms, make sure it's very clear how you're protecting your patients and their data, and make sure if you are doing some kind of intervention that you clearly state whether or not it is standard of practice. And if it is not, describe who and why the person performing this intervention is qualified to do it. Those are the kinds of things that the IRB is going to want to see to feel comfortable approving your proposal. And those are the things that, if not well explained, are going to result in us holding up your submission to get our questions answered.
Great, very important points. Thank you. So we are almost out of time, so I thought we would address one more important question about consents. So I just put in the chat if any of you have any questions that we can address in the last 10 minutes. We only got through actually half of our questions, so we might need to do part 2 of this. So anyway, I'll have Dr. Paxton address this first. So when do you need written consent for a study, and when is verbal consent or waiving consent acceptable?
Well, I'm going to say I think we got through most of our questions because unfortunately they bleed into each other. I think we covered the material in those questions. We just didn't point out that we were.
Sure.
But no, I think it's a great question. In fact, I would say, because again, the IRB is primarily focused with safety and risk benefits to subjects, I think informed consent is one of their biggest considerations. And it's a landmine for a researcher who isn't aware of how important it is to the whole process, really. So there is a document, and I'm sure those who have done research know that the informed consent form is what a patient signs or a subject signs. And this is an explanation of the research, including the risks and benefits, including alternatives to participation, And it usually is written, and it should be written in layperson's terms. They have to sign that, and they have to have a witness who signs next to them. That's, usually it's a member of the research team. And so this is a documentation that you've obtained informed consent for participation in the study. The biggest mistake that a lot of investigators make is not putting enough time and effort into that document. And I think that's a huge mistake, right? So that's going to mess with your approval. That's going to create difficulties for your protocol. So if you're enrolling subjects, that's an important part. But the question is relating to consent. When is consent needed? When is written consent needed, verbal consent needed? I would suggest that written consent is going to be needed in any case where the subject's going to be exposed to more than minimal risk and the IRB has determined that it's required. So the IRB has the ability, your local IRB has the federally granted ability to decide that your protocol may be waived and exempt, not exempt, don't use that word, may be waived from obtaining written consent from subjects. Now, why would they do that? Well, emergency care research, as an example, is extremely challenging in obtaining consent. Patients in cardiac arrest, as an example, cannot sign an informed consent form. They are in cardiac arrest, right? So when they come in and I need to study them, there is such a thing as exception from informed consent or waiver of informed consent, depending on whether you're dealing with a drug or some other intervention. And those are federally mandated and approved ways in which the IRB can give me permission to do certain things for those patients prior to getting or attempting to get consent from their LAR. And that's because of the emergent nature of their presentation. They're coming in a cardiac arrest and there's no family at the bedside. That's why I'm getting permission. But importantly, I'm getting it from the IRB in advance. It's not something I can go later and say, hey, can't you give me an EFIC or a WIC on this? No, it has to be in advance. It's a priority. So when I submit the protocol, they're going to review it and say, well, we think you have an opportunity to obtain informed consent, so we wouldn't grant you that waiver. And that's their prerogative, and they will do what they think is right in terms of patient care. But there are ways that they can allow or provide a waiver for informed consent. If that has not been done and you are expected to get consent, then it will either be written or verbal consent. Verbal consent, really, there's no paper trail. So it's extremely unusual for an IRB to grant that for anything other than the most minimal risks protocols. Usually it's going to be written consent or a waiver of consent. I will say, as a caveat to all that when we do retrospective chart review projects, we don't obtain consent because maybe we're going to enroll 10,000 patients from the EMR. We can't possibly go to those 10,000 people and ask permission, right? So the IRB routinely offers waiver of consent in those situations where it's a retrospective chart review because they understand that practically it's impossible. You can't do the project otherwise, right? And so research would stop dead, zero, period, couldn't happen if you had to get consent on everyone in a retrospective study. But it's different in a prospective study because they will evaluate whether you will have the opportunity to obtain informed consent based on the clinical circumstances, the specifics of your protocol, and other factors that they consider important locally. But I think it's a key point here to make that the local IRB has the authority to waive written consent. They have to choose to do that. I don't get to decide that. I can ask for it, but they have to just make the decision.
Dr. Misa, can you please comment?
Yeah, no, the written consent is extremely important and takes a lot of time and deserves your attention because it's also a receipt for the subjects because it discloses all of the potential adverse effects of participating in the project. And most consent forms, no, I'm sorry, I should say all consent forms include the name of the PI and a way to contact them in the event the subject has any questions after they have participated either that day or if their participation requires several days, there's a way to contact somebody to let them know, hey, you know what? I don't know if I want to continue participation in this project, or I'm having a problem after having gotten this medication, and maybe it's placebo, maybe it's not, but somebody needs to be informed. Now, I've been doing this for a few years, and I can tell you these consent forms have gotten longer and longer over the years. I mean, we had an IRB meeting last week, and we reviewed a few protocols, and the consent forms are 13, 16, and 18 pages in length, describing everything. It is so important that the patients have an opportunity to read it, and they sign it and get a copy of it.
They should do a study on who reads the consent. I'm just curious. Dr. Misa, can you also talk about just minimal risk so everybody's on the same page of what that actually means?
Yeah, I mean, so minimal risk basically means that there is some chance that you will be affected by participating in this research. And this applies to surveys. I mean, Dr. Malik mentioned this at the top of the hour. People think surveys are no risk whatsoever, but when you engage in a survey and you are asked certain questions, your behavior might change after you've participated. You might think about questions and about situations in a context and in a way that you didn't think about them before. And therefore, whether you're a physician who has asked your perception on how to manage hypertension, for instance, they're not going to give you what the right answers are during the survey. They're just going to ask you your perception of this, that, and the other. So when you go to your next shift, you might change how you address hypertension. And it might be for the better, which is fine, or it might be for the worse. There's no way to know. And this is why that is considered minimal risk, and even survey studies require IRB approval, and they do deserve a written consent form by the participants.
Great, thank you. Dr. Malik, do you have anything else to add?
Only that if you're going to try and pursue something where consent is waived because of the degree of severity of illness in the patient, you're going to have to work doubly hard in your methodology to convince the IRB of why what you are doing is important and why the scenario is such that it would be okay to not obtain consent.
Great, important point.
And Lynn, if I can make one other quick comment about
Yes,
this.
please.
That's a great point to make. That, in the modern day, informed consent forms can be 20 pages long, as Dr. Misick mentioned. And at the end of the day, the IRB and everybody else involved understands this is crazy, right? That a 20-page consent form is a challenge even to read, let alone understand for anybody. And so what they've done more recently, since 2019, revised the expectation for informed consent. And it's usually on the first page of a consent form now, there's something called the key information statement. And the key information statement is going to have like 5 key factors that you want this patient to remember from this whole document that they're going to review and sign. And usually that's a statement that the project is researched, that their participation is voluntary. It's some kind of a brief summary of the research, including the purpose, duration, and things, and some of the major risks and benefits and alternatives to being involved. So I think it's an important distinction to make. IRBs recognize that it's challenging for subjects to process 20 pages of information. We want them to understand what they're signing, not just sign 20 pages. So things are done to try to facilitate that, right? At the end of the day, everything is always about the patient, safety, information, understanding that they're providing an informed consent. It means they understand what they're getting into. That's important.
Thank you. We have one question from the chat that I hope we could address, which probably applies to many people listening here, and that's on medical education. So the question is, in the context of medical education research, what types of studies would be considered to be on people? This type of study is obviously different than when testing treatment protocols on ED patients, and it's confusing to know which types of educational studies are considered to have impact on learners and thus need IRB involvement. Dr. Misick, do you want to talk about that?
That we could talk for hours on that one question alone. It's complicated. And different institutions have different requirements and different ways of addressing that issue. But learners are considered a vulnerable population. And learners who are asked to participate in a project may be participating because of perceived coercion. And that is an important area where the IRB needs to weigh in. So I don't know if we're going to be able to answer that in the last 2 minutes, but I would suggest if you have an education project, especially if you are taking groups of learners and you are randomizing them and not subjecting every learner to the same activity. One group does it in sim and another group does it via a PowerPoint presentation, and then you want to disseminate those findings later on. Please talk to your IRB, because that is considered research, and you should get some kind of consent, because those two learners, those two different groups, might end up treating patients differently. And at the end of the day, it's the patients who will be affected by that learning intervention or that learning study.
Thank
I'm sure
you.
my colleagues have a lot to add as well. Yeah.
I just wanted to share a story of a long time ago. I did a study on cadavers with a airway device. So the regional director came and I had it all set up for these cadavers, and I thought it was exempt because it was on cadavers. And they told me when I was wondering where my letter was, saying that they approved it and it was kind of exempt or whatever, but they told me, no, this needs to go through full IRB approval because you are studying medical students' ability to intubate on these cadavers. And I was comparing the device, it was like some kind of video laryngoscope many, many years ago, versus just the standard way. And so everything was going to happen in 2 weeks, and nothing gets approved from the IRB in 2 weeks, but I got approval in 2 weeks. I pounded on everybody's door, hand delivered everything, made several phone calls with a desperate plea, and actually I got approval, and they said, we've never done that before. And I told them I will never do this again. So anyway, but it does, you need to involve your IRB, and students are people and can be affected by the research. So just Dr. Paxton and Dr. Malik, Dr. Paxton first, any comments on this?
Well, I think in your example that you provide, great example, you were studying the students, not the cadavers. If you were studying the cadavers, there would be, IRB would be exempt, but you weren't. You were studying the students, and the students are as Dr. Misick said, these are vulnerable people. These are people whose entire career rests on approval from their trainee, their trainer, their supervisor, their attending, whoever. And so they are vulnerable to coercion because they may do something thinking that they're going to get extra bonus points if they say the right answer to the question. So I think at the end of the day, it deserves attention from the IRB because of their status as a vulnerable person. Now, when someone reviews the exemption categories, especially pre-2019, they're going to say, well, it says pretty clearly in there that educational research is exempt. Well, that's not really true. So what's really exempt is studying traditional techniques of teaching, as an example. That's exempt under class 1 of the exemption. And category 2 exemptions can be related to other specific like educational interventions, surveys, interviews, and so on. But these are situations in which the person is de-identified, that there's no potential for injurious result from, maybe they get a bad reputation because of their responses, or data is collected that's identifiable to them and that gets lost and mismanaged. So at the end of the day, like, you don't think of as students as being like patients, but they're still subjects. If you think about it as subjects and human subjects, which is the real term, students are humans and they're subjects of research. So it makes more sense when you think about it that way. But you're right, it's confusing to people when they read that, oh, educational research is exempt. In reality, it's usually expedited, but it's not often exempt.
It always depends, right? So Dr. Malik, you have the last comment.
Again, this brings it around full circle to what we were talking about in the beginning, and specifically with medical education research. I think this is where a lot of people try to pursue survey studies and teaching intervention studies. And again, I would just highly recommend that you run all of them by your IRB, because there are so many ways that your IRB may look at this and say, this could potentially impact your learners, your subjects, in a way that's meaningful enough that they need to provide consent to participate in it. So the big thing with studying medical students, studying residents, is the psychological impact of whatever intervention you are trying to perform on them may change their perceptions of themselves in a positive or negative way that they need to know about, or may actually end up, though it is not the purpose of the study, changing their behaviors in the way that they practice, which is a non-zero risk to them participating in this study. So again, be very, very careful with all those survey studies. They are not your easy off-ramp to avoiding the IRB. It's much better to have them presented to the IRB before you try to do these studies, to make sure that they are done rigorously and well, so that they are not potentially harming anybody that you're looking at. And honestly, at the end of the day, being able to submit a manuscript to a journal that says that you submitted your survey study to the IRB for approval just makes it look like you performed this at a much higher level and put a lot of thought into the methods of what you were doing. So yeah, and medical education research, traditional clinical research, industry research, any of it, it's always better to just err on the side of caution. If you are going to be studying a person, just touch base with your IRB. and make sure that you don't put yourself behind the 8 ball by trying to pursue something that should have been IRB approved without the approval.
Thank you. Thank you all panelists. You guys were amazing. Hope those listening found this to be helpful, because I learned some things, and I'm sure you did too. But that concludes our webinar for today. So hope you'll join us again. We plan on producing one of these a month, focus on some kind of different research topic, and we might maybe have a part 2 on the IRB process, because there's so much information to convey. Anyway, thank you all.